From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., the Congressional Report, with your host, Iowa Congressman Tom Latham.
This country is based on farms, on small businesses, and creating jobs and opportunities. That is the lifeblood of this nation.
And now your host, Congressman Tom Latham.
Thank you for joining me on this edition of the Congressional Report. The economic recession has hit hard in Iowa, just as it has throughout the United States. Unemployment figures are rising, and many of those who have lost jobs live with anxiety and insecurity. In Washington, a debate has emerged how the country should proceed in the face of the struggling economy. Some in Congress want to expand the role of government with new spending and bailouts for large companies and financial firms. Others seek to rein in spending and trim the federal budget. They argue that a lighter tax burden will free working families to pursue prosperity. Regardless of the path we choose, the debate will have a lasting impact on the role of government for years to come. The decisions made in the coming months in the White House and on Capitol Hill will shape the social compact between the people and their government. With so much riding on the outcome, it's critical that we all stay informed and take part in the democratic process. Joining me today on today's program to talk about the role of government in the economy is Chris Edwards, the Director of Tax Policy Studies for the Cato Institute. And I welcome Chris. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Congressman.
You bet. Tell us a little bit about the Cato Institute and also your background. How did you get this job?
Well, the Cato Institute is one of the many research think tanks in Washington, D.C. We try to provide good research information for you folks in Congress and for the general public on the problems with big government and some of the problems with high taxes. So we try to educate both the public and the members of Congress, and we've been around since the 1970s. We're free market oriented. We believe we agree with sort of the vision of the founders of this great nation that people ought to generally be left free from the government in Washington.
Very good. And your background, as far as where did you study and your
I moved to Washington about 20 years ago to get my master's degree in economics, and ever since I've been research tax and budget issues here at various places. I worked for Price Waterhouse for a few years here in town, helping corporations minimize their burden of taxes and various other jobs.
Talking about the current economic situation, what do you see as how did we get into this? What caused it? What do you see lessons we could learn from what happened?
I think there's a lot of mistakes made both in the private sector on Wall Street and a lot of mistakes made by policymakers in Washington. I think now it's clear that the excessive amount of housing subsidies we provided, both on the spending and the tax side of the budget, got a lot of Americans into homes that frankly they could not afford. And that worked for a while when housing prices were rising, but after the 2006 peak in housing prices, we sort of found out pretty quickly who couldn't afford those gigantic homes that they were buying. Also, I think the Federal Reserve policy has not been as stable as it could have been. I think that there's just an excessive amount of liquidity pumped into the economy earlier this decade under Chairman Greenspan, and that led to kind of the housing bubble that we saw, and a financial bubble, and unfortunately that's crashed now, and it hasn't just hurt Wall Street, but it's hurt the broader real economy as well.
There's a real debate about the regulation. Some will argue that there was not enough regulation, and this probably is true in my mind with the credit default swaps, things like that, the derivatives that were unregulated. But there's also the argument that there was too much government mandates as far as making loans, especially in the home mortgage market, and with Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae being basically required to take 50% or more of their loans to be subprime, and with no verification of whether someone could pay or verification of their income. I don't know where you come down on that, or is it both? Do we have too much regulation in one way and not enough in another? Or?
You know, apparently we don't have the right type of regulation, and you know, you can't just rely on regulators, of course. As we found out with the Bernie Madoff scandal, the Securities and Exchange Commission was asleep at the switch. This gigantic fraud was going on Wall Street under Madoff, and the SEC completely missed the boat. So I think what we need to do is we need to get the incentives right first. If we get the government incentives right first, then private actors will be less tempted to break the rules. So we need to get the right regulation, and you know, some cases that might mean less regulation, some places it might mean more regulation. Certainly, if you go back to the 90s. The Department of Housing and Urban Development here in Washington under Bill Clinton, they promoted excessive home ownership in a whole variety of ways. And so the seeds of this crisis, I think, started, 15 or more years ago.
Now, you've written some books about the economy, about tax policy. What was the meat, I guess, of the books that you've written?
Well, last year I published a book called Global Tax Revolution, and I looked at this revolution in tax cutting that's gone on around the world since the 1970s. Before the 1970s, countries, they traded less with each other. There was less flows of capital and money over borders, and countries like the United States were somewhat more isolated from the world economy and from competition. That really all started changing. We've got these enormous flows of corporate investment going over international borders now. And some early leaders like Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States realized that that meant we needed to cut our tax rates, both the business tax rates and the individual tax rates. So we've seen tax rates tumble around the world over the last 3 decades. And that's been generally a really good thing. I think the expanding trade and investment is a great thing for the world economy. But one of my arguments in Global Tax Revolution is that the United States has fallen behind now, particularly on the business tax side. There's many countries, even in Europe, with much lower corporate tax rates than we have now in America, and we need to catch up. I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't give our corporations a good place to invest and expand.
How do we stack up as far as tax rates, corporate tax rates around the world?
Well, we've now got the second highest corporate tax rate in the world at 40%. The only country with a higher rate now is Japan, and we know that the Japanese economy hasn't done very well over the last few decades. But, you've got countries like even Sweden, famously kind of a socialist country. Their corporate tax rate is only 28%. Again, ours is 40%. So, I think we ought to do at least as well as Sweden, frankly, on the business tax side.
Yeah. And it's a matter of being competitive in the world market.
Absolutely. This is, I think to a lot of, average folks might figure, well, what do these corporate taxes have to do with me? And I think they have a lot to do with average workers. I mean, unless we get some of our big corporations investing here in America, they will start investing more abroad. They're not going to be building the new factories here. So, whether it's pharma companies or technology companies or the automobile companies, the corporate tax rate really does affect where they invest, and we want them to invest here in America.
We've had spending go through the rough around here. We had the $700 billion TARP, the Recovery Act, last year for the financial markets. It was supposed to shore up our Wall Street, in essence. They had $787 billion stimulus package that was supposed to help us get through these difficult times. We've had a $410 billion omnibus appropriation bill, about a 9-10% increase in funding on an annual basis, but it's only funding the next 6 months of the government. And there's, we just this past week the defense supplemental, another $100 billion. What effect does all this spending have on our economy? Does it help us get through the recession? Does it hurt us? Does it contribute to the recession? What's your opinion?
I think what's been going on is that there's just been far too much focus on the short term here. Economists debate whether, the spending might help the economy in the short run. I don't think it does, but I think it surely hurts us in the long run. In the long run, this buildup of debt we've got going on in Washington is going to lower our standard of living. It means that in the future, we're going to be a lot of the income that average folks earn is essentially going to go to pay the bondholders, the creditors, for all this debt. So under Obama's recent budget plan, he's got the federal government's debt soaring from about 40% of the economy up to about 80% of the economy, an astronomical number. We haven't seen debt levels that high since World War II. So this is a very dangerous path I think we're on here, and again, in the long run, it's going to hurt the standard of living of average people.
You look at the budget that was just passed, $3.6 trillion, and the spending blueprint basically for the next 5 and 10 years. Under that, I think we're tripling the national debt in that budget, basically saying that we're going to be $800 to $900 billion on interest alone. And what does that do to the economy when you have the government with this insatiable need for more revenue just to service the debt?
I think, economists have long told us that if the government spends and borrows too much money and the Federal Reserve starts printing too much money, as it has been doing in recent years, ultimately we're going to get a substantial bout of inflation. We don't see that now because we're in a recession, but the big fear is that once the economy starts growing again, maybe later this year, maybe next year, inflation is going to start rising, and then it's going to be the 1970s all over again, where we had a combination of high unemployment and high inflation, and that becomes very difficult to start unwinding. It took the recession in the early 80s and the Federal Reserve clamping down on money growth and pushing interest rates up to enormously high levels in the early 80s to finally get the situation under control. So the fear here with these high spending and deficits is inflation down the road.
Well, when do you see that affecting the economy? I mean, some people talk about it maybe a year or 2 years out, that inflation is going to soar, interest rates are going to have to soar because we have this need to finance our debt, so we're going to be bidding up interest rates and basically to attract capital to this country.
I really don't think anyone has a good answer for that. I mean, the hope is that when the economy starts growing again and we start seeing some of this higher inflation, then the Federal Reserve will skillfully sort of reverse course and start taking some of this extra money out of the economy. But I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see how skillful Chairman Ben Bernanke is of the Federal Reserve in sort of unwinding this inflationary bubble that I think he's been part of creating here.
Well, we talked earlier a little bit about globalization and how we're in obviously a world market in everything we do. How has the recession affected, say, Europe, China? Are they in better shape than we are, worse shape? How do you read that?
Well, I mean, countries like China and India are still growing fairly quickly. They've slowed, but I think it's to the great benefit of the overall world economy that China and India keep growing. I think the more that those countries grow, ultimately, the more exports they will demand from the United States, whether it's farm exports or, industrial exports. So I think that is good for us. We ultimately will get out of this recession. I think regardless of what Washington does, the U.S. economy is a market economy. It always ends up growing. I don't think all these recent stimulus and bailout packages have helped the economy, but I do think that, ultimately, America is a land of great entrepreneurs and free market capitalism, and the economy will grow ultimately regardless of what Washington does.
That's encouraging, actually. I always look at the stimulus package, the $887 billion plan. There's only about 25-30% of that actually will be spent this year, and about another 20-30% next year. But an awful lot of it is funding that's spending that goes out 3, 4, 5 years from now. And
right.
If you're talking about stimulus package, I mean, you think it would have an immediate impact. People talk about the highways and bridges and infrastructure, but in reality, the highways and bridges are only about less than 4%, I think, of the whole package.
Right.
I'm concerned, and I've had several meetings with constituents coming in, and they look at the increased spending on a lot of different programs in the federal government from the stimulus package, and that basically just increases the baseline
right.
of what we're spending here. And so now we're at a new higher levels, and now we're going to percentage-wise increase that over time, which really compounds.
That's right. And we've already seen with, President Obama has proposed some of these supposedly temporary spending or stimulus programs. He's now come out in his full budget wanting these programs to be permanent. Right. And this is, of course, a great fear that while the majority Democrats say that some of these programs are only supposed to be temporary programs, they will ultimately push to make them permanent. And, that's the last thing we need is a permanent expansion in government in Washington.
Well, that's the thing I've learned in my years here in Washington, that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program.
Right.
And they have their own life, and it goes on indefinitely. Well, where do you see in the federal level, are there areas that you believe that we should be cutting spending today that wouldn't affect, say, the getting out of the recession, but where do we go to find some common sense on the budget?
Well, something's going to have to there's a big budget crunch coming with federal finances. We just can't sustain these trillion-dollar deficits indefinitely. And with the retirement of the baby boomers and the expansion in the Social Security and Medicare program, something's got to give here. So the big fear from my point of view is that I think that there will be a big push to expand the tax base in the United States. Just about every other industrial country has not only an income tax system like we have, but they have a big value-added tax on top. Countries in Europe, they pay income taxes, but people pay this national sales tax, or VAT, which is often about 20% of the cost of everything they buy. I fear with these gigantic deficits, if we let them keep going, there will be a big push down the road by liberals to try to impose a national VAT in the United States. So that's a big fear down the road. So we've got to try to fight and limit spending now in Washington in order to ward off this gigantic tax increase down the road.
There is a raging debate, and you mentioned, I think earlier, back with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, about reducing tax rates. What effect does that have on the economy and also on government revenues when you actually reduce the tax rates?
Well,
historically, what has it done?
I think the best thing we can do for the economy is to reduce tax rates, because that affects people's behavior. If you increase taxes on a small business, the academic literature clearly shows that they hire less people, they invest less. If an entrepreneur has less money, he's got less money to invest. Entrepreneurs and businesses, when you think about how they operate, they look to the future. They think, well, should I build this new factory? Here's, my profit before tax. Here's my profit after tax over the next, 10 or 20 years. It's a big decision for them. And if you sort of increase the wedge of profits that goes to Washington, they're less likely to invest and thus less likely to hire people.
Well, do you have a position, or maybe you can expand a little bit? One proposal as far as revenues for the federal government is this cap and trade. Some people call it cap and tax, as far as our energy policy, with the idea of addressing global warming, climate change. But a lot of people believe that this is going to, we already have the second highest corporate tax rate in the world. Probably the most difficult regulatory schemes in the world, the most litigation anywhere in the world today, and to add on a dramatic increase as far as the cost of energy, especially in heavy manufacturing. And we're trying to save the automobile industry today, but we're basically putting this new tax on everything that they're going to be producing. What effect is that going to have?
I think you framed the issue perfectly, which is that we're already less competitive on the corporate and small business tax side to a large extent. And one of the remaining advantages that America has is its generally low energy prices and low energy taxes. I mean, the price at the gas tax prices at the pump in Europe are much higher than in the United States. And when you think about the United States, it's a country that spreads across a continent. We rely very much on transportation and having this gigantic integrated market here in the United States. Cheap energy is really a driver of this economy, and we really have to think twice before we start imposing a big tax on energy and making us less competitive.
And I real concern about driving all these jobs overseas when the manufacturing, we've lost a lot in the United States anyway, and I think this is really going to have grave concerns about what the impact that's going to have, especially through the Midwest, where we don't have, like say California, as much wind. We have a lot in Iowa, but wind and solar alternatives that we get credit for, but it's going to dramatically increase the cost for even individuals in their home. Flip on the light switch and have an increase in taxes.
Well, there's no reason. I mean, I think the way to think about this is not to favor, coal or natural gas over wind and solar and other sort of alternatives. I mean, I'd say let's let the market decide. Let's cut the business taxes on all types of business, whether it's solar manufacturers or energy oil producers, and let's find out what's efficient. There's no reason why, entrepreneurs do amazing things here in America. Silicon Valley is a testament to that, of course, and let's get some of that entrepreneurial spirit going in some of these alternative energies, but I think let's leave it to the market and reduce the tax and regulatory burden on people, and I think we can produce great things.
Yeah. Kind of change speeds a little bit. There's a real concern and a debate going on in Washington, I think across the country, certainly I hear about it all the time back at home, is that with the TARP funding last year, the $700 billion with the stimulus funding now, that government is taking a larger and larger role as far as management and intrusion in private enterprise. When you look at the banks, they're going to be talking about controlling the compensation for the executives. When you look, even this a couple of weeks ago, the administration basically told Chrysler how much of an advertising budget they could have, or they had to cut that. And there's a real concern, I think, with a lot of folks that with more and more government control in private enterprise, that it's going to have some grave consequences. That's the debate, I guess. I don't know what your opinion is, or what do you see as the role and long term? What effect does that have on our country?
Yeah, again, I think part of the problem of what's going on in Washington in the last 6 months is that we're reacting to all these short-term crises and creating new precedents in how government should operate. So, for example, the Federal Reserve over the last few months has been doing these unprecedented things that kind of no one ever thought were in the Federal Reserve mandate. The same with the Department of Treasury, is taking all these sort of unilateral actions that I never thought the Treasury had the power to do these sorts of things. And, people say, well, it's a crisis situation, but we are creating precedent here for the long term. This expansion in government power, once it happens the first time, it's hard to sort of put the Pandora back in the box and get the government limited again as our founders sort of believed. I think once, and this often happens in crises. Wars, for example, are times often when the government gets expanded power, and it doesn't like to give up that power once it's got it.
Do you say, and I come from Iowa's predominantly rural, is there, if you looked at, maybe you haven't, as far as any different effects that the recession has had as far as rural America compared to metropolitan America or urban America? Is there any differential, do you think, or is this just everywhere?
It's an interesting question. I think with globalization, there's less and less of a difference between the rural and urban economies in America. I think, every industry, whether it's agriculture industries or high-tech industries in Silicon Valley, they've got to be globally competitive. And so and with the expansion of, broadband internet to rural areas these days, and the, improvement in the transportation infrastructure, I see less and less of a difference. I think, we need national policies that make both the rural and urban areas more competitive.
What do you see after we get through this recession? And we're talking the agenda today in Washington, obviously with a massive increase in spending in a lot of different areas. There's no question. I mean, this year we're going to have a $1.84 trillion deficit, one-year deficit, 4 times larger than any time in history. To get through that, but down the road, when we look at if there is a much larger role of government, say in healthcare, in the cap and trade, as far as energy taxes, things like that, increased tax rates, what effect does that have long term, or what are we going to look like in 10 years?
Well, I think, as we discussed, President Obama's budget projections show the government debt soaring to levels we haven't seen since World War II. And in certain ways, his projections are optimistic. So, there is a big crunch coming down the road. I think one of the things we have to start looking at in Washington is start to get Washington out of some of these activities that were traditionally state and local activities, like education and transportation. It doesn't. There's no free lunch in Washington. If taxpayers in Iowa are sending money to Washington to pay for highways, it trickles through the federal bureaucracies, and then members of Congress from Iowa have to sort of fight for their share. But there's no sort of net gain there. If you kept the tax money in Iowa, I think Iowans could figure out for themselves what local infrastructure and state level infrastructure they should finance. And you send the money to Washington, and it gets hijacked by the special interest. It funds the bureaucracies here. I think that's all waste we need to reconsider.
We're out of time. I could go on forever visiting with you. Very, very interesting, and I appreciate, Chris, very much.
Thank you very
the
much.
fact that you came on. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
You bet. This country is navigating stormy economic waters right now, but I have no doubt that America will emerge from the storm stronger than ever. Her people are resilient, and her resolve is unbreakable. The debate in Congress and the decisions we make now have the power to speed up the transition to prosperity or to delay it. The stakes are high, and I'll work hard to make sure we get it right. It's crucial that members of Congress hear from their constituents during such a critical debate. If you'd like to learn more about my stances on the economy, or if you'd like to get in touch with me, let me know what you think, please. Please visit me on the website at latham.house.gov. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next time on the Congressional Report.
From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., this has been the Congressional Report with Iowa Congressman Tom Latham. Have a question, comment, or concern? Congressman Latham wants to hear from you.